Hi, everyone. Welcome to SAIS's Rethinking Iran event and book forum today. My name is MANIJEH. I'm an assistant professor at SAIS Johns Hopkins University, and I welcome you here today along with the co-director of the initiative, Professor Vadinas. Today, I'm really excited because we are hosting the author of a new book that's just come out. And in addition to being the author of this great book, she's also, we overlapped at our time at NYU together during our PhD studies, and we're good friends. So I'm just excited to have this conversation with someone I deeply respect and I think has a lot to say about the history of Iranian student activism and revolutionary movement within the United States, both in the 70s and in today. So I'm excited to introduce to you all MANIJEH Moradian, who is an assistant professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at Barnard College. She received her PhD in American Studies at NYU and her MFA in creative nonfiction from Hunter College at the City University of New York. She's the former co-director of the Association of Iranian American Writers. Her writing has appeared in many places, but I'm just going to shortly list some of them. The Routledge Handbook of the Global 1960s, Scholar in Feminism Online, Women's Studies Quarterly, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, Social Texts, Jadaliyya, and many others. She's a member of Jadaliyya's Iran page editorial board and a founding member of the Raha Iranian Feminist Collective. And importantly, she's the author of today's book, This Flame Within Iranian Revolutionaries in the United States. So welcome, MANIJEH.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. So as I was telling you before we got online, this is it may be the only academic book that as I was reading it, I was like snapping in agreement with so much of what you were writing about in here. And the book struck me for a variety of reasons. One is that you are giving language to so much that I think is important for us, those of us who study Iran and Iranian diaspora, but also for those who think about American studies and the histories of different groups of people who make up what is the American project in any way possible. And then when we talk about revolution itself. So I want to start off with talk with you about, you came into this project, and I think part of the reasons that you are able to frame and give us language in a different way than I've seen from other books about this time period is that you are coming at this as an American Studies scholar. So what is that? What does that vantage point give you to coming to this subject? And then also why this subject for American Studies?
Great, thank you. These are wonderful questions. So yeah, I have often felt like a sort of strange interloper in the worlds of Iranian studies. But my location in American Studies, I think, definitely shaped and spurred this project. I was in graduate school at a time when there was a lot of interest in the third world internationalist politics of the 60s and 70s, right, as a challenge to not only US empire, US imperial hegemony, but also as a challenge to more narrow forms of identitarian politics that we've really seen in the 80s, 90s, and ongoing have been often incorporated in a kind of neoliberal multiculturalism. So that, racialized populations have been both, heavily targeted in different ways, but some have been sort of incorporated within the status quo in a way that kind of, erases some of the more radical histories of what anti-racist politics meant, and the forms of coalitions across difference that were really, initiated, invented, innovated, in the 60s and 70s. So I was in graduate school at a time when there was this renewed interest in going back and looking at like a whole kind of subfield, was like Afro-Asian connections, looking at solidarities between, African diaspora folks and Asian diaspora folks, and the way that anti-colonial revolutions really transform people's identities and transform their politics and their orientation in the world. And I kept thinking, but the Iranians were part of this. Where are they in this story? You know, and the reason I knew they were part of it is because, of course, my father was a student from Iran who came to the United States in 1960 and kind of settled at Howard University, a historically Black college, and was part of all of the major movements of the era, from civil rights to the movement against the Vietnam War, organizing around Palestine, organizing around really like solidarity with every anti-colonial revolutionary movement that was going on, because he felt connected because of his experience growing up under a US-backed dictatorship and his experience of the 1953 CIA coup, backed by the US and British coup. And so he felt like he had something in common with all these other groups of people who were sort of also, whose freedom was also being subverted and denied, right, by the US government or by US-backed dictatorships. So it was kind of out of his own lived experience, his own, what I came to theorize as a kind of like affects of solidarity, right, that he really participated in all these movements. And what I wanted to understand more about was, okay, it wasn't just my father, he was part of the Iranian Students Association. So what was this organization and how much did they participate in other struggles? And what role did they play in these kind of high points of third world internationalism and US-based social movements in the 60s and 70s that we kind of look back. Sometimes we look back, with a lot of nostalgia to those times as if it was like, those were better times, where it was somehow there was a stronger left, stronger movements, more solidarity, whether that's true or not. But, we can often look back nostalgically. And I wanted to understand more about the role Iranians played, and also what it was really like for them, to come from Iran and to find themselves in a US society that was going through massive upheavals, right? That was in a state where many young people were in a state of revolt, and how they were able to relate to and intervene in and work alongside those other activists.
So in that, as you're doing this research, as you're trying to sort of figure out some of these questions, the methodology that you take on and that you sort of employ for your research and for this book, I would love to dig into that a little bit with you. Like the archives you went to, I thought were really fascinating for this. The types of people you spoke to, and then from there, I'm going to teach this book in many classes, but I'm going to definitely recommend the sections you have on affect to, I think, especially folks who teach in anthropology and sociology and spaces that speak about this, but the way that I saw you define it and take us through it and then show the connections to these types of politics that you're talking about, I thought was so powerful. So can you talk about your methods, and then also what I want to get more into the depths of revolutionary affect and affects of solidarity later. So we'll table those for now, but just how you were looking for affect and what that was telling you.
Yeah, sure. So I knew for this project, I knew that I wanted to interview former members of the ISA. I was very interested as a feminist scholar in how in the intertwining of personal histories and larger geopolitical histories, right? And in the way that people's life stories, their lived experiences kind of become a record of how history is mapped onto bodies, right? How people actually experience these big events like migration, revolution, war, things like that. So I knew I wanted to interview people. And I also wanted to I was interested in interviewing people who they themselves were kind of in what I think of as like an open relationship to the past. So this is part of my whole methodology is that, it would be very easy to dismiss the Iranian student movement and the Iranian left more broadly, because of course, during the revolution, many of them gave support to the Ayatollah Khomeini as the leader of the revolution, and this turned out to be, a tragic and horrible mistake because, of course, the new government turned around and persecuted the left. And so the door kind of got closed, in many ways, on really thinking about the leftist experience and mining it for anything kind of value. I think there was a lot of shame, a lot of narratives of failure, tragedy, complicity. It was very, very difficult, I think, especially for those folks who ended up back in the US to really even have a space to talk about what they had tried to do as young people in a way that wasn't completely overshadowed and dominated by what happened later, right? Which of course they didn't know at the time. So now, of course, we only have hindsight. We can't go back in time, but I wanted to try to create a space of as much kind of like openness and non-judgment as possible, so that folks could really grapple with who they had been, what they had done, what they understood the project to be at the time, and to grapple with the legacies, right? To grapple with the very difficult and hard legacies of what resulted after the revolution. So I was interested in finding people who wanted to talk about it in that kind of complex and nuanced way. In other words, there are maybe people who were part of that movement who have completely renounced their past and said everything we did was wrong. Well, that's not that interesting of an interview. You know what I mean? So I wanted to find people who were really living with the aftermath and really working through the legacies and the remains of that whole experience in complicated ways. And so it was sort of through word of mouth. You introduced me, of course, to some of your family members who were part of this movement, which was wonderful. And so it was kind of this, what we call the snowball effect, right? Through word of mouth, finding people referring me to other people. And I did over 30 interviews. I couldn't use them all. The book actually was way too long and I had to cut like huge amounts of stuff. So I ended up using about 30 interviews. And then in addition to that, I wanted to do archival research because initially I wanted to try to understand, how did the Iranian movement show up in, for example, the broader student activist milieu, right? So I looked at campus newspapers, which on many campuses became very left-wing. By the late 60s and 70s, they were really covering the movement, right? That's really what, for example, at UC Berkeley, the Daily Californian, a daily newspaper, right, that was really covering all the protests, everything, student strikes on campuses. I looked at several student newspapers to see like what influence did the Iranian Students Association have? How was their movement being represented? Was there evidence of them working with other groups, being part of other campaigns? I looked at movement, the archives of the ISA, their periodicals and publications and flyers. I looked at the San Francisco State Strike archives, right, and I found all this evidence of Iranians participating in the historic 1968-1969 San Francisco State Strike. I looked at archives at Howard University. Again, not only my father was there, but many other ISA members were there. I looked through their newspaper, The Hilltop, which I believe was weekly. To look for, what impact was the ISA having? How did the Iranian freedom struggle circulate? How were other students taking up that cause and connecting their struggles to it? And I did find like really, I was really rewarded for these efforts, which sometimes the librarians were like, wait, you're looking for Iranians and how, and it's like, yeah, trust me, they were here, and then I found all this fascinating stuff, I found, for example, at Howard, the first demonstration that Iranian Students Association participated in at Howard was in support of Palestine, actually, and they were like making connections with indigenous struggles here. And, it was like they were trying to convince Howard students like to care about Palestine, and then I also found, of course, after many years of organizing, many other students, Black students, understood the struggle in Iran through the lens of the ISA and Howard was also a location for many African foreign students came and were involved in solidarity with their liberation movements back home, and were making all these connections. So there are these wonderful articles, really showing that kind of solidarity. There are articles about the Shah's policy in Africa and why, if you care about the liberation of Africa, you have to care about liberation in Iran, because the Shah was supporting these reactionary white supremacist regimes. So, all of that stuff was there, and I learned so much that I didn't know, doing that kind of research. And so, but I think that I mean, shall I talk about sort of how I came to think about that?
Yeah, I wanted to just say, as you're talking, and as you're sort of painting for us this picture of where you were going in to look for what was going on at that time and to tell this history, you were seeing, and this is where the title of your book, This Flame Within, which comes from one of the interviews of the ISA members, but also then it's in relationship to why they were showing up to all of these different protest movements. And so this idea of the affective solidarity, can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so exactly. So when I was interviewing people, or when I was seeing all this in the archives, it felt like a stupid question, but I had to ask people, so why were you involved in all these other movements that, at least on the surface level, had nothing to do with Iran? The San Francisco State Strike was about, racism and admissions and hiring and curriculum, and it wasn't about US policy in the Middle East or Iran. Why were Iranian students getting arrested and risking deportation and, all sorts of persecution back home to support, these anti-racist struggles here, or the anti-war movement in Vietnam, and many other things. And so I began to ask people this question, and my interviewees would sort of look at me like, well, but of course, it was such an embodied way of being for them. It felt so obvious to them, because it was so much just like how they lived their lives, that I had to kind of really draw it out from people. And so, yeah, the book takes its title from one person in particular, Jalil Mostashari, who actually lives in Iran now, but he was a member of the ISA in the mid to late 60s in East Lansing, Michigan. And at that time, he told me, I was a member of, the NAACP, the Muslim Students Association, the Du Bois Club, the UAW. I mean, he just was part of every organization. And I was like, so why we, And he said, you have to, if you want people to sympathize with your struggle and your needs, you have to really sympathize with their needs. You can't just say it he says, you can't say it with your tongue. You can't just say it rhetorically. It can't be empty words. You have to believe really in your heart, that these other struggles really matter. And, he said, you have to have this flame within you that can warm others, and I just thought that was a beautiful metaphor for the kind of affective capacity, for change, that the flame is a kind of energy. It's an intensity, right? It burns, it warms, it moves, it ignites, it fuels, right? In the way that affect is this kind of capacity, this potential, this indeterminacy that can be channeled and oriented and attached to many, many different things, right? And that's the really interesting thing about affect, is you can't know in advance sort of how it's going to manifest or be expressed or be mobilized. But in the context of a really active student left in the US, in the context of decolonization movements globally, in the context of upticks in struggle in Iran, and upticks in labor struggle in the US, these kinds of major movements that were happening in the US against racism and war. This was a context in which affective capacities, people's affective orientation could be channeled, right, towards identification with other liberation movements as somehow connected to one's own desire for freedom. And that's really the key thing for me, is that affects of solidarity, it's not charity, it's not pity, it's not the same as what we sometimes call being an ally. I think it's slightly different. I think it's really coming from a position in which you yourself are already affectively attached to your own liberation struggle, right? That your own desires for revolution, for liberation, for freedom, can overlap and kind of intertwine with those of others who share those similar desires, right? Even if their histories and demands and conditions are different. So affects of solidarity becomes this way for these distinct desires for transformation, for social transformation, could actually become integrated, intertwined, and diaspora provided unique opportunities to do that. Of course, people in Iran were following movements around the world. They were reading literature from revolutionaries around the world. It's not that people in Iran were isolated or, didn't have a global perspective, far from it. But in diaspora, you could actually meet side by side. You could sit down and talk to people. You could go to each other's demonstrations. You could learn from each other. You could have joint meetings. You could actually share notes, if you will, about the different experiences of US-backed coups d'etats in places like Chile and Iran. And, you could actually meet each other. And so diaspora provided a very unique context in which people really could think their struggles in relation to one another. And I think that was really an incredible thing that got to happen, right? And that did really shape and change people in really interesting ways. So that's some of the legacy of the ISA that I want us to hold on to. I mean, the book engages with a lot of their problems and mistakes and things that I wouldn't want us to repeat. But there are certain things that I think we really do stand to benefit from, really learning from the what I call the kind of like theory and practice of solidarity, right? These as a kind of way of life,
Yeah, which is so different, as you were saying, from how we think about it today, or the language for it today, which is allyship. Or this idea of like how we support movements going on today by like sharing on our stories or posting on this or that, right? And I'm not trying to demean any of that, but I'm just saying it's so different from this affect of solidarity that you are theorizing for us here, and also showing how it happened and how that tie to this idea that liberation is both local and extremely global, and that they're tied to one another, and how, so like for, just that, and that revolutionary affect that comes out of this affect of solidarity that you write about.
Yeah, so that was kind of the way in. First, I wanted to understand, why were Iranians showing up in all these other movements? What was motivating this? And then my other question was, I would ask each person was, so how did you become political? Because, just to sketch it out briefly, the majority of Iranian students who were coming to the United States, in the aftermath of the coup, and increasingly the numbers were just going up throughout the 60s and 70s, they were overwhelmingly from pretty elite backgrounds, given the population of Iran at the time, right, which was majority illiterate, right? So who were the people who got to go to university in the first place, and who were the people who could either access scholarships or afford to come abroad? It was, of course, mostly upper middle class, folks, although there were shifts in the 70s when some children of white collar oil workers, for example, were sent abroad. So there were some important demographic shifts in terms of class, but overwhelmingly, given the population of Iran, this was a relatively elite group. And they were, positioned, I call them imperial model minorities, and I won't explain the entire derivation of the term, but, they were essentially, they were a strategic part of US Cold War policy in the Middle East and around the world, right, which was to develop and modernize along capitalist models, third world countries, to prove that, capitalism could bring progress. And this was the alternative to communism. And this is part of their whole Cold War development strategy in places like Iran. So recruiting foreign students, having a cohort of Western educated natives who could go back home and be the professional, managerial, technocratic class. That was absolutely essential for transforming these societies into modern capitalist societies. So these Iranian students came from relatively elite backgrounds. They stood to gain from coming here, getting a Western degree. They would, could go back home and have very lucrative careers and do really well for themselves and have a place of great respect and influence in their society. So given that, why did a minority of them, but a significant, few thousand over the years, right? How does it happen that a minority of them kind of refused to go along with that plan? Like if we had a narrow idea of self-interest, they would have just gone along with that plan. They stood to benefit from it, right? So I wanted to understand why the folks who joined the ISA, how did it happen that they kind of went rogue, went off script and didn't fulfill the imperial model minority script that was sort of written for them. So it was in those conversations that the folks I interviewed started to talk about their childhoods and very visceral memories they had of state repression, of the coup. Some of them are old enough to remember the coup and its aftermath. But people really had memories of, soldiers in the streets, tanks in the streets, the government suppressing protests. They had teachers or relatives who had been arrested and tortured. There was this, just this incredible outpouring of formative memories of what it meant to live under a dictatorship, right? That as children, before they really had an analysis or even fully understood what was going on, impacted them, again, at the level of the body, at the level of affect, right? Even long before they had vocabularies to make sense of it all, right? They were affected by these encounters with the dictatorship and its violence. And they were also affected by encounters with a kind of often very hidden, but nonetheless tradition in Iran of democratic and socialist opposition. They had family members who were involved in different movements, and they were aware that there had been alternative possibilities for Iran, that Iran didn't have to become a dictatorship, right? That people had desired and fought for other futures, right? That didn't come to pass. So I ended up theorizing this idea of revolutionary affect as the kind of embodied remains of these encounters with state repression, but also with resistance. The experience of going on a demonstration as a teenager or seeing a demonstration go by and seeing people being beaten up or being beaten up yourself, or, people have all these memories long before they were sort of, quote unquote Marxists, long before they had identified as a leftist or read any leftist literature. They had these experiences that traveled with them to the United States, in which there was already a student revolt underway, and in which there were other Iranian students who felt the same way, and they found each other in the Iranian Students Organization, which became a kind of vehicle for the expression or manifestation of these revolutionary affects. And so revolutionary affects are kind of, they become the affective attachments that sustain revolutionary activity, right? The desire for change, the desire for revolution, the desire for freedom. And within that, there are many, many emotional states that can result. Revolutionary affects can manifest as alienation from a dominant, US imperial model minority script, where you're supposed to be grateful and happy to be in the most advanced country on earth and believe that the US is helping to uplift your people. Well, what if you don't feel that way? What if you're alienated? What if you're out of sync? So sometimes it's affective dissonance, right? Where you don't feel the way you're supposed to feel about the thing, i.e. Western education or something, right? Or it can manifest as rage. I mean, the number of US universities that were awarding the Shah honorary degrees year after year after year, really kind of whitewashing the torture and brutality going on in Iran, giving cover to that, glamorizing the royal family. I mean, students were really angry about this, right? But so yes, so there's a kind of militant stance that people wanted to take in the face of this kind of kind of cover up that was happening, right? Where the US media was very, really celebrated the Shah and the Queen and, really kind of glamorized them and kind of had this sort of like imperial affective synergy going on with them. So the students wanted to cut through that. They wanted to expose the realities of the regime back in Iran. They wanted to create public pressure on the US government to withdraw support, for the Shah. So they cared about impacting the opinions, the feelings, the affects of Americans around them. So revolutionary affects can also manifest as joy. I mean, there's a kind of euphoria of collective struggle that people also describe, that feeling of being in the streets, that feeling that you can change history, that another world is possible, right? That's part of it too. And that's some of the stuff that people I interviewed really hadn't had much of a chance to reflect on, just given how painful the past 40 plus years have been and how much they lost. But the last piece I'll say before pausing is that the other thing I was really interested in with revolutionary affects is that, diaspora is sort of famously, of course, constructed around a set of losses, right? People have to have had to leave home. But what those losses are, how people name them, what people are nostalgic for is not always the same. We kind of assume that the Iranian diaspora is nostalgic for pre-1979 Iran and sort of the good life under the Shah. But what if people in diaspora, Iranians in the US, are nostalgic for those high points of third world solidarity, those moments when they felt like they were part of a larger historic and global freedom struggle that might actually win? What if you're nostalgic for the possibility of, a democratic Iran that never came to be or hasn't yet come to be? And that's why I think I borrowed the term from Mariana Hirsch of resistant nostalgia. That is also, I think, an important revolutionary affect in terms of how desires for change, how affective attachments to revolutionary struggle live on in the aftermath of revolutions gone wrong, right? That the losses people are mourning, are sometimes, actually index those earlier hopes and dreams and possibilities that get kind of foreclosed if we just sort of look at official histories of like, the Islamic Revolution, won, and that was it. And, but of course, within that process were all of these other ideas and possibilities and dreams that live on in diaspora, I think at the level of affect and memory and the body. So I wanted to try to participate in that kind of intergenerational transmission of affect in diaspora by telling and sharing these stories.
Wow, MANIJEH. Yeah. And by you doing that, you talk about, or you write about in your book, how you're making interventions in Iranian diasporic studies and in the history of Iranians in the United States. And you really interestingly, I don't know if others have done it, but I love you talk about it as an intersectional Iranian diaspora studies and an intersectional Iranian diaspora sort of inquiry. Can you talk more about that? It was so generative for me to read that and to sort of think with you along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely. So this, I had been, it's sort of like the fusion of different, you bring different threads and influences together, when you write a book. And that's one of the most challenging, but also I think most rewarding aspects of it, is to finally like connect the dots in your own head, your own intellectual influences, right? So I have been trying for a very long time to think about or to articulate a way out of this, what always felt like a kind of binary trap between, the sort of like US-Iran conflict, this US-Iran standoff, and the way that the diaspora always feels sort of caught in between, right? Especially during the 2009 Green Movement in Iran, when the diaspora was really galvanized into mobilizing in solidarity with, democratic movement there. It really felt like a moment in which we had at least I was trying, and with my comrades in the Raha Iranian Feminist Collective, we were trying to figure out how to stand in solidarity with people in Iran while also opposing US intervention in Iran, since we were in the US, and we found that that was very tricky, very hard to do, that a lot of the expressions of solidarity that were coming from the diaspora were not really taking into concern our actual location in the US, where, of course, we have, sadly, a sort of like long history now of the sort of appropriation of Iranian people's freedom dreams by a kind of neocon regime change agenda in the US, which I don't think has the best interests of Iranians at heart. So we were trying to figure out how to articulate that position back then. At the same time, one of my major intellectual influences, political influences, is women of color feminism, third world feminisms, Black feminisms, reading memoirs by people like Audre Lorde when I was studying my MFA, and then, studying intersectional feminism in graduate school, and I teach a class on intersectional feminisms. So really being steeped in these non-Iranian genealogies of, how feminists of color, how feminists who are targeted and marginalized based on race have had to theorize, a more capacious understanding of what the meaning of freedom and liberation has to mean, right? That we have to think about how gender, sexuality, class, race, how all of these things intertwine, overlap, intersect. So I'm drawing on these other genealogies because I think that the problem that we face in our diaspora is it has its own flavor and specificity and history, but conceptually, it's not a new or unique phenomenon of how do you have, how do you have a critique of what's oppressive about, say, Iranian society without feeding into narratives that would justify things like, the collective punishment of Iranian people, especially through things like war. So I wanted to argue, and I do in the book, that, in order to understand the lived experience of Iranians in diaspora, and I happen to focus on the ISA, I think we have to think not just about national identity or religious identity. We have to think about different forms of racialization. We have to think about how gender and sexuality and class intersect and complicate how people are read, how they orient themselves, how they're situated, what their own political formations are. And the fact is that revolutionary affect in general is always embedded in social relations and social hierarchies. So for a lot of the Iranian women who were involved in the ISA and involved in the Iranian Revolution, they had their own affective attachments to freedom, right, to liberation. But the experiences that they were drawing from were gendered and were different than the experiences that many men were drawing from. And some of those dissonances and disparities really come to a head in 1979 itself, around the big question of, are women going to have equal rights in the new society? And I have a chapter that looks at returning ISA members and their participation in some of those debates and contestations back in Iran in 1979. But so part of what I mean by an intersectional Iranian diaspora studies is really borrowing from, Black feminists and other women of color feminist traditions to say that we can't just think about race. We have to also think about gender, sexuality, class, religion, all the different structuring, not just oppressions, but identities and sites of power and struggle, right, that shape us. So that's one meaning of it. The other meaning is what I was saying before, that we have to think about, I think, Iranian society and the Iranian diaspora as always existing, at the intersection, right, of these geopolitical forces, right? And so our diaspora has been shaped by the intersection of US imperialism and dictatorships in Iran, and that's been true for a very long time, certainly since 1953. And so the student diaspora I write about again, as I said, was what was created, the scattering of Iran's best and brightest, right? Why did they have to leave, right? They had to leave to get a Western education, to come back and oversee this kind of Cold War project, right, of modernization. So again, that's at that's the collusion between the Shah and the needs of U.S. empire in its Cold War battles with the Soviet Union, right? So that's what produces the pre-79 diaspora of students. Post-79, of course, the new authoritarian government in Iran and U.S. empire are not in collusion. They're at loggerheads. They're in conflict, but nonetheless, it's that conflict, right, that produces a new diaspora, and also that shapes us in the U.S. in particular. I mean, it's different in different parts of the diaspora, but I'm focused on the U.S. Because of this, because this is where I am, but also because of U.S. empire, right? So I think that we have to always be cognizant of the fact that we have to have a double critique. It's not enough to only critique the Islamic Republic or only critique U.S. imperialism. And unfortunately, we have many examples of people who only do one or the other, right? And to me, that felt very similar to the way that women of color have always been told you have to choose between being a feminist or being an anti-racist, right? You have to choose between, your identity in terms of your race or your identity in terms of your gender and sexuality. And that's why I think intersectional feminisms are so powerful and enabling and important, right? Because it's a rejection of those dichotomies and those binaries. And it says, no, we actually can be critical of all the oppressions. We can be critical of all the forms of all the obstacles in the way of our freedom. And we can look at how they actually work together, how they work hand in hand, right? How race works through gender and sexuality. They're not separate. Well, the dictatorship in Iran, even now, even for these last 45 years, what is the relationship between that dictatorship and U.S. imperialism, sanctions, threats of war, right? There's a relationship there, right? They work in tandem to obstruct the liberation movements of Iranian people. Even at the most basic level of, every time Iranians rise up, the Islamic Republic says, well, you're a Western, you're backed by the West, and that's a way of justifying a crackdown, right? And it doesn't certainly, the problem, of course, is that the West is actively trying to interfere and meddle in Iranian affairs. So that truth then gets weaponized by the Islamic Republic to crush, legitimate aspirations of ordinary Iranians. So this is a problem. So we have to be able to have a double critique. We have to be able to think, in nuanced ways across these multiple sites at all times, I think.
Yeah, and MANIJEH, I wish we had like 3 hours to talk. You like every time you say something, new things are going off in my head. I mean, I want to get to a couple of things here that you just said in your response, and that is that, oops, sorry, I don't know, I went somewhere for a second. And that is that your feminist analysis throughout this entire book, one of the things that you're doing with it is you're turning that feminist analysis to organizing in the 1960s and 70s, both within the ISA itself, but also, I loved this move that you made. You then took those critiques and then also applied them to scholarship coming out today about different kinds of anti-colonial movements at the time for liberation. And then when like the part where then you connected it to the post-colonial critiques or the post-colonial states that come and their the way in which they are so high, they are just through and through patriarchal, that lens. And then the fact that this book came out during the uprisings, the recent uprisings in Iran, both because of the feminism at the heart of the slogans and the movement of that, but also because of the anti-imperialist lens and how that's not manifesting in this time as much. We don't know if it will or not, but in this moment.
Yeah.
And your book, you're hitting on all of these different things. And so it's both about that time period, but it gives us such an incredible framework for understanding today too. So, I mean, I can give you a question from that, but I would also just like love to hear you like riff on that, however you want to take it.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think I was, I wanted to think about the Iranian Students Association in all of its specificity, but also as a case study of the broader third world Marxist-Leninist, anti-colonial formations of the time, which they were really a part of, and part of this is that I'm interested in the left, and I'm interested in having a better left, and so I'm interested in critiques of the way that the left has too often reproduced hierarchies within it, especially around gender and sexuality, has reproduced exclusions and marginalizations. So that's one concern. The other concern is the way that people read everything that's wrong with Iranian society in a very reductionist way all too often, right? As if it's all can be reduced only to, Islam or something about Iranian culture. And I thought, well, this is interesting because we have a group of secular Marxist Iranians who ascribe, in the ISA, who ascribe to kind of Marxist-Leninist third world politics, which are very common at the time in many, many countries, among many different groups of people, among white students in the US, among Black students in the US, among Chicanx, you have this like whole third worldist milieu that they're part of, right? So let's actually look at what were their gender and sexual politics, right? And what we begin to see is really what, third world feminists pointed out, it gave rise to third world feminism, right, as an intellectual and political location, right, which is that you have all these women participating in these anti-colonial and anti-racist formations and then experiencing sexism and patriarchy, male domination within their own movements, number one, but also there's, in terms of what they're fighting for, their vision of national liberation or revolution doesn't really have much to say actually about the lived experience of gender and sexual oppression, right? At best, those were going to come after the revolution, right? First, we have to get rid of imperialism or capitalism, then we can look at these other problems. So there was a kind of, what I end up calling like a hierarchical model of liberation that's very masculinist, and that doesn't mean it wasn't appealing. A lot of women really were so excited to be part of this revolutionary movement. Like I said, they had their own affective desires for revolution, transformation, freedom, and the rest of it. But the terms on which they were incorporated into these movements were still, deeply problematic, and really didn't really challenge the idea that that being female, that femininity or being female was somehow a problem. It was a degraded category. It was a sexualized category. Of course, colonialism, was a huge part of this, right? That the way that colonialism, fixated on women's bodies, unveiling and the sort of Western penetration of Iranian society, and it's, our women and their honor, and, our women are being turned into sexual commodities, and we have to restore our dignity, and, all of those kinds of discourses, right? So the category of women, femininity, all of this was very degraded, and women revolutionaries had to kind of prove that they were not that, and the
and
way
you say that the masculinist definition of even what proper revolutionary activity was.
Exactly. You could not, wear skirts and makeup and be a serious revolutionary. You essentially did have to erase signs of femininity, wear baggy clothes, cut your hair, not care about your looks,
MANIJEH, what's so fast, like as I was reading that, then later on, after I put your book down, I was on Instagram, as we do, and Aramita Abbasi, who was one of the young women who was taken into prison in Iran during this recent uprising, she came out, and she's always been very active on her Instagram, and always in a very sort of not being apologetic at all about her body and who she is as a woman. And she's been getting so much hate because now they want her to be a particular kind of revolutionary icon.
Right.
And
Right.
she is being her and showing her body in the ways that she wants to, and got so much hate that she deleted all of her posts. And like, and it just, the parallels with what you're writing about, and that even today, as we're supposedly having this incredible uprising, but very quickly after the first 3 or 4 weeks, men just take up all the spaces of debate, all the spaces of discussion. And it's obviously things have changed, but the critique that you're making here is just so incredibly fundamental.
I mean, I hadn't even heard about this latest example that you mentioned, but yeah, the need to constantly police women's bodies. So, I mean, this idea that women's bodies are inherently sexual, this is a problem that has to be regulated and controlled. It's a problem for revolutionary movements because the men could be distracted, or, you know, it's like, it's really this sort of real reproduction of a kind of patriarchal, need to dominate and control women's bodies, right? And so, of course, women push back against this, all the time, everywhere, in many ways, but within the ISA, within the Iranian left, within other leftist formations of the time that were not Iranian. This is where, a kind of third world feminist politics emerges from. It's from the women involved in these larger revolutionary movements, right? So I kind of wanted to, again, incorporate the Iranian experience into that larger story of how third world feminism developed. Because you have Iranians are participating in, from diaspora, which is my focus, in a liberation movement, right, to liberate Iran, right, and having these experiences and developing these critiques. And so I do talk about the ways that women in the ISA pushed back against what they called male chauvinism, and they really did try in many ways, in terms of like practical organizational kind of fixes to have more women involved or in leadership. What they weren't able to challenge was the broader theoretical questions, right? About how women are positioned as a problem or a threat. And they weren't really able to develop a kind of robust feminist iteration of anti-colonialism at the time for different reasons. But what happened, of course, was when folks went home to join the revolution in 78, 79, returning ISA members, of course, quickly got involved with all of these different left formations that were happening in Iran, people who didn't leave, who had been there all along and were part of the revolution, right? And that's when things really come to a head, because that's the moment, right after the Shah leaves, where all of the unity around getting rid of the Shah very quickly turns into a lot of disunity about what's going to replace him. And one of the first flashpoints is the issue of mandatory hijab. Are women going to be able to decide for themselves how to comport themselves, what to wear, how to express their religious faith or not, and move freely through the society, And for many women who had been part of overthrowing the Shah, they rightly understood that the earliest announcements of mandatory hijab that were made, I believe it was March 7th, 1979, that the provisional government first said women have to wear hijab to go to government offices. This immediately brought tens of thousands of women into the streets, because they rightly understood that a government that was going to try to dominate and control women's bodies was also going to take away many other kinds of freedoms. They rightly understood that as the kind of first salvo in a kind of authoritarian turn that would limit freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, many, many other basic democratic demands. And so some returning ISA members were part of that outpouring, the kind of women's uprising that happened in early March in Tehran in 1979, around International Women's Day. But many, many were not, because, like I said, the idea of prioritizing and centering women's equality, women's bodily autonomy, women's freedom, and equal citizenship, quite frankly, was not a priority. It was not a priority because of this hierarchical model. The idea was that the revolution is in danger from US imperialism, and we have to have unity. And if we raise issues around women, that's going to be divisive, that's going to create disunity, and that's also going to create a kind of weakness that the imperialists will exploit. right? And because the majority of women who were actually protesting against mandatory hijab were themselves in favor of the revolution, this was disorienting for them because they didn't want to weaken the revolution. They didn't want the imperialists to come in and use them as a way to destroy. They didn't want any of that, right? So through a combination of that kind of undermining of them politically and through, quite frankly, vigilante violence by Islamists, that uprising was driven off the streets, right? But I think that a generation of Iranian women who lived through that became feminists. They absolutely became feminists, and they brought a feminist analysis into the center of their politics. And of course, we've now had several generations of different iterations of Iranian feminism and women's organizing inside Iran that tried to work through existing channels, that tried every possible, brilliant creative strategy they could think of to try to challenge gender discrimination in Iran. And because those efforts, they achieved certain things, right? But they didn't change the legal structures, and they left, women are still vulnerable to tremendous state violence because of their legal formal inequality. So I think what's incredible to me is to see this arc, to see, from the late 70s, when issues of women's control over their bodies and women's equality were considered secondary at best, if not dismissed entirely, to see those now as the starting point for revolutionary struggle and activity, that's the baseline, that's the center, that's the catalyst for all the other grievances, economic grievances around ethnic oppression, right? But it's actually the right of women to be of patriarchal state violence and to control their own bodies that was the starting point, and you can no longer say, oh, that's secondary, it doesn't matter, we'll leave that till later, right? Although people may try. As you say, we have to constantly shore up the feminist center of this movement. It's a constant struggle, but I do think the starting point has this history to it, right? Has this arc to it. That people learned really the hard way, the hardest possible way, that gender and sexual freedom have to be part of and are intimately connected to any real meaningful sense of freedom and equality, that we can't leave those out.
Yeah. And, the other thing, and we're not going to have time for this, but that I want to make sure people need to get this book, because one of the other things that you are putting in here that you draw on from that experience, and also in the conversation that we've been having, that is, I think, really, really, it's a conversation we're not having as loudly, I think, as maybe we should be right now. But what you point to is, and what we've been talking about is, the continuation of the meeting of Iran and the United States, like the meeting of Iran and US empire in different ways. And pre-1979, it was one way. Post-1979, it's been different. But that because the Islamic Republic has taken on the mantle and the rhetoric of anti-imperialism, it has turned that language, I don't want to say off, but the volume is extremely low. Yes. And so not only is there a danger to that, because then we're unwilling to see the multiple forms of pressure that are happening, but also because, as you then point out, is right now we're beginning to see neocons and the right come in and just take up the space. And that is, we know how that playbook plays out in the Middle East.
Yeah. So I'll try to wrap up on this. Thank you for pointing this out. This is so important. So when I was researching and writing the book, the word revolution, it was the same. It had been so co-opted by the Islamic Republic, which, let us not forget, rules in the name of a revolution. Like the word revolution was their word, And for a long time, people would not talk about revolution in Iran. That was off the table. It was a dirty word. It was a co-opted word. People talked about reform, they talked in other ways, but the idea of revolution, that word, that concept had been so destroyed for people that they had no identification with it, and it was part of the lexicon of their oppressor, right? Yeah. But we've seen that now. I mean, it's incredible to see that change. I mean, when I was interviewing folks for the book, they were like, I wish we had a different word. That's because revolution is so tainted. Like, we can't even use that word, but like, we need another word because we still need a massive transformation, but we don't have a word. Well, we've seen how through collective struggle, people have reclaimed that word, right? Mm-hmm. People have reclaimed the word revolution for our side, right? For the side of feminism and liberation, right? I think we have to do that for anti-imperialism, quite frankly. I think the Islamic Republic cynically uses that term. I think that in many ways they've enriched themselves during the sanctions regime. They have, they have benefited from the standoff as much as they possibly could at the expense of ordinary Iranians. They are regional imperialists themselves. Yeah. They claim to care about oppressed people, Palestinians. They don't. They cynically exploit other people's movements in the region for their own foreign policy agenda. I think we have to delegitimize them entirely around any claims to being a genuine force of anti-imperialism or justice for oppressed peoples in the region. And I think the way to do that is that we have to take, if we want to come up with another term, that's great. I'm all for it. If we can think of another word for it, fine. But the concept is still the same. We have to take it away from them. We have to expose their rhetoric, expose the empty cynicism of it, and the damage they've done to the region, in the name of anti-imperialism. And quite frankly, they've adopted the war on terror. The Islamic Republic wages its own war on terror as a way of suppressing dissent. So, they like to take terms from the West that are convenient for them and deploy them for their own ends. I think we have to reclaim anti-imperialism for our side, because unfortunately, the Iranian people have there is more than one threat, and there is more than one danger. And I do think that the sort of fledgling revolutionary movement in Iran is in great danger. It's in great danger primarily from the internal repression of the Islamic Republic. Obviously, that's the boot on people's neck. That's the immediate source of violence that people are facing. But, every day now, it seems there's another news report about US-Israeli joint military exercises and threats and machinations. And unfortunately, those threats have not gone away. And so I think we have to really take it seriously, so that we're not caught off guard. And so that, we actually can be in solidarity with the self-emancipation of Iranian people. Not only do Iranian women not need saving, but Iran as a nation is not going to be liberated from any outside power, and nor could it be ever, right? Like, the whole point is that people have to get to decide and determine their own fate. And what makes me hopeful is the way that women's liberation is now at the center of that conversation. Not only national liberation, not simply the idea of borders and sovereignty, but the idea of gender and sexual freedom is at the heart of that conversation now.
Oh man, MANIJEH, thank you so much. What a gift this conversation was. And your book is amazing. Everyone who's watching, please do get this Flame Within. It's incredible. And thank you for all of the language you've given us. And it also just gives us such an amazing framework for today. So thank you, MANIJEH.
Thank you so much, Nargis. This was wonderful.